All right, welcome everybody. Great to see you all at our latest Future Directions Forum presentation. This is a workshop about one of my favorite topics. We'll have, as many of you might know, we have lots of workshops still rolling out in October and November, and we'll have some presentations in December as well. And but for today, we're going to be doing working together on various topics in relation to using principles of storytelling or narrative to improve the clarity of your academic writing. You can consider this kind of an extension of some of the workshops we've done on storytelling through the forum. Show of hands, who here has seen some of our storytelling workshops? Anybody? If people have not seen these yet, no big deal, because one of the things that I'm going to be doing first is today is I'll do a brief recap of some of the basic principles of narrative structure so that we're all caught up on sort of the basic idea. And then I'm going to spend the grand majority of time working with you all on this idea of writing mechanics. It's one thing to know the active ingredients of storytelling, and it's quite another to sort of use that structure to then make decisions about when's the right time to go from one paragraph to the next. When's it the right time to connect one sentence, an idea from one sentence, to a related but distinct idea in another sentence. How to go about making those decisions to build up from sentences and paragraphs to whole papers, and making sure that the entire piece of work you're composing has narrative structure infused throughout. And then we'll do like a group activity. We'll break out into groups somewhere around the middle of the presentation to sort of work through an illustration of how some of these mechanics come to life in the work itself. And the two books that are here, there are a lot of what we're talking about today with regards to narrative structures borrowed heavily from Randy Olson's Houston, We Have a Narrative. I think it's an essential text. Any of you who are new to using storytelling when you're writing, I heavily recommend it. I first became enamored with this book back in 2015. So just 7 years ago. It is never too late to learn it. And I think that once you learn about narrative structure, it really just changes the way you think about writing, and writing in always shapes and forms. And then the book to the right of the Houston book is basically an extension of those ideas. So instead of thinking about narrative structure like we are today, about how to compose one piece of writing, all the other book basically is doing is saying how you can scale up those principles to sort of connect findings and ideas across different pieces of work together. So, where a lot of the work in narrative structure sort of falls into is related to some ideas germane to science communication generally. And that is that researchers don't get a lot of practice communicating very well to each other and communicating to the general public. And as a consequence of that, a lot of the work that we construct is written in a pretty dry fashion. And by dry, I mean we're typically trained in our programs to sort of communicate facts in a sequential way, where each fact is preceded by a subsequent fact, and there really isn't that much discussion about how to organize those facts in a sequence that makes the evidence you're discussing engaging, thought-provoking, and importantly, memorable. Because at the end of the day, that's what we want. We want to be able to communicate information that lands with an audience effectively and ensures that they walk away knowing a little more than they did when they walked in. And so that's basically where we're going to be spending most of our time. I like this slide because now I'm going to show you that how I just spoke with you, how I just enumerated those ideas are essentially the active ingredients of writing, of story, of narrative structure, of using narrative structure in your writing. And when you even look at the operational definition of story, which I think Olson has a pretty good one, when you think about narrative structure, it's just a series of events that happen along the way in the search for a solution to a problem. But therefore, why do stories work? Stories tend to work because your audience, the people you're writing to, unless this is like a diary, unless you're writing to yourself and not planning on communicating the information to other people, you're communicating to, an audience of people that are processing that are used to processing information in patterns, not necessarily in individual chunks that don't have any connection to each other, but in patterns. And what we know from years and years of research is that our brains process information in an efficient means insofar as there is a readily identifiable connection among those pieces of information. Storytelling is basically a way to sort of get a complex set of pieces of information down to a structure that people are used to consuming information in. And so every great story you've ever consumed, every engaging piece of work you've ever encountered, whether it's a film you saw, a book you read, a news article you read, a podcast you consumed, to the degree that it captured your attention and to the degree you remember any of it, the likelihood is very, very high that each of these three things was in that story. Each of these three things was in the thing you consumed. At the beginning of that story, you received a couple pieces of information that gave you an idea about what things were going to entail. You're shown a world. In a movie, that's typically what it looks like. You're introduced to a world that you might or might not have any exposure to before you saw the movie. So you get used to seeing a few things. So this and this, at least setting the stage based on at least a couple of pieces of information germane to what you're consuming. Then somewhere in the middle of that story, you get a new piece of information that creates a conflict, creates a tension in the facts, in the sequence of events that you're consuming. And the rest of the story is all about trying to resolve that tension between what you were exposed to at the beginning and the conflict introduced to you in the middle, right? And you see this in all kinds of stories all throughout your experience with stories. I mean, there's a reason why it isn't until the second movie in the first set of Star Wars movies that you find out that Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's dad, and it's no coincidence that that it isn't until the last movie you figure out that Princess Leia is Luke Skywalker's sister. I mean, that's in every single story you can think of, and that's what makes this way of thinking about storytelling, this structure, engagement, conflict, resolution. What makes this so attractive in the context of research is that researchers like things that are easy to predict. We like seeing principles that work over and over and over again. I mean, one of the reasons why I like cooking so much is that, unlike a lot of the work in a lot of my own findings, I can make something out of a set of ingredients and have the same kind of reliable experience with it over and over and over again. All right. And any of you who are familiar with principles of learning, probably see some connection between storytelling principles and, for instance, the classic Wagner model of learning, where learning increases insofar as you see a discrepancy, a distance between what you expected to encounter and what you actually encountered, right? Observed minus expected. The greater the distance between those two things, the more learning you get. Okay, those are the basic principles of narrative structure. And, but, therefore, engage the audience, give them a conflict, resolve it. So now we're going to get a sense of the degree to which you can overlay those principles onto all of your writing. Not just, okay, I got to accomplish these 3 things over the course of my paper, but then how do you get there? How do you actually connect the ideas together? And we're going to use a couple of examples to get there. We're going to start with an abstract and then scale up to a full paper. Before we get there, I as you might suspect, I use a lot of metaphors when I talk about this kind of stuff. I try to sort of connect these ideas to things you might be familiar with. And when it comes to to papers, I like to think of papers the same way as I do anything else. Anything else, if you break it down to its essential elements or components, you'll see a combination of things. You'll see the things you absolutely need for them to be there, right? In any one recipe, and then all the things that are collectively combining or working together to bring those 3 things to life. And I think stuffing is like that. I think stuffing is an amazing thing to eat. It's great. They can make it in so many different ways. But there are certain aspects of stuffing that when you think about it, when you think about like the top 3 things that absolutely need to be in a stuffing recipe, these are my 3, but it might be other ones that you might come up with, right? And if somebody comes up with a 3-ingredient recipe for stuffing, I'll build a statue in their honor. But that's not how stuffing usually goes. There are those 3 things you want to achieve, but then a lot of other things work in concert to bring those 3 things to life, right? And then you see this idea. If you have active ingredients like the and but therefore template for storytelling, you can start seeing a lot of those kinds. You can see these sort of basic principles, unpack for themselves, not just in writing, but in other places where great stories happen. So if you think about anything you've consumed in the last few months, a great book, a great movie, a great series, a great podcast. What you can do is sort of pick out like one thing that really resonated with you in that story you consumed, in the book, in the movie series, in the Hulu series, in the movie, in the podcast. And in all likelihood, that one moment stood out for you because it was embedded in a larger context. It was intentionally placed where it was placed to bring about a big effect. The guy on your screen is Alfred Hitchcock. Alfred Hitchcock, was obviously a renowned filmmaker. And one of the key things about Hitchcock's filmmaking was that he told great stories, but oftentimes he thought of particular moments in his films that he wanted down to the most intricate image or detail to stand out in a certain way. He knew where to place it, but he knew exactly what image he wanted to present. He actually storyboarded big, really important moments in his films, like The Birds or Psycho or what have you, and would say, this is a drawing, this is a vision I have for the film, but it's not just a vision. I want this actually recreated in this moment, at this portion of the movie, in this exact way. And he did that because he knew that every one decision that he made for that film the question was always the same. How did this thing that I'm going to do, how does this one thing help me tell my story? And that's the principle with regards to these mechanics. Whenever you're thinking about using a transition, moving to a new paragraph, starting a new, introducing a phrase that's going to play a big role in the remainder of the paper you're writing. The question you're always asking yourself is, how does this help me tell my story? If you think about it that way, then what you wind up seeing is that there are particular kinds of sentences that we all use for things like abstracts, for the introductions sections of our papers, for the method sections of our papers. There are certain kinds of sentences that we all use. They have a particular purpose, and they usually connect to the purpose of other sentences. And it's almost like when you write an abstract, yeah, it's got to have the and but therefore in it. But as I'm showing you here on the screen, it's almost like those sentences are like items on a scale of storytelling. And the and but therefores are like factors. So any of us who do factor analysis, any of us who know that certain kinds of items on scales behave similarly or differently depending on what they're designed to reflect. And that's kind of the way our sentences operate when it comes time to actually doing things like writing abstracts or writing full papers. So what we're going to do to illustrate this idea that every bit and piece of your paper is functioning in the service of a larger story, we're going to start small. I'm going to show you how this sort of comes to life with an abstract from a recent paper from our lab. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take a break. I'm going to have you sort of work through a second article, very short, just 2 pages. And then we're going to break out into groups with that article to sort of walk through, like, what about this article sort of resonated with you? Can you pick out those mechanics within the writing that helped tell the larger story of the introduction, which really just appears on the first page of the paper? Okay, so what I'm going to start off doing is highlighting for you specific portions of the abstract that we're going to show. I'm going to show you an abstract on the next slide. And then I'm going to show you sort of elements that you'll see in other places too. Like these actual little pieces here, they don't look that much different than some of the same kinds of sentences you might write when you're preparing, for instance, the specific aims of an abstract, or the specific aims of a grant application summary page that you'll see with the NIH or NSF. All the principles are more or less the same. Okay, so take a moment. I'm going to give you about a couple minutes to read through this abstract, and we'll talk about it on the other side. Okay, all right, let's get started. All right, so this is one of the things I love about narrative structure. You can tell a story in several hours. You can tell a story in 90 seconds, in 30 seconds. There are actually a couple of different stories in this abstract. And we'll get to that in a bit, but I'm going to walk you through each sentence and show you how it sort of reveals the larger structure that's embedded in the abstract. All right, so first thing you notice, every abstract starts off with like a broad context, a general context sort of statement. This you know from the first sentence that this is this paper is going to be about social anxiety, and it's in particular it's going to be talking about discussing social anxiety in the context of how adolescents interact with people they don't know very well, typically their own age. That next sentence afterwards still has to talk about social anxiety, but it starts to sort of shrink the emphasis. What was referred to in the previous slide as a narrowing context. The first one's a general context. We're going to zoom in a little bit, and you know that within the context of this study, within the context of this paper, we're focusing very specifically on how these symptoms and impairments manifest, or how these interactions, the relevance of these interactions for how we actually treat social anxiety, with in some circumstances with exposure-based therapies. And then we zoom in a little bit further. There's a second kind of sentence that still tries to narrow a little further. Right? And this sort of gets this idea of, we want, there's some recent work that indicates there's a particular way in which these exposures can work and can yield optimal effects. All right. So those first three sentences, the ideas have to connect with each other in these kinds of ways, start broad and start narrowing a little bit to then set the stage for what the conflict's going to be. Because the conflict to this story, has to be maximally relevant to the narrow topic that you're discussing in the paper, and it has to happen pretty soon. So you have like these first three sentences, they're setting the stage, and with all these abstracts, the mechanics have to get you to the conflict fairly soon, so that you have enough space to be able to talk about what you're actually going to do in the paper. That's exactly what that third sentence is. That third sentence is you're introducing a conflict, a problem, a thing that has yet to be solved, right? That's the purpose of that fourth sentence. Usually, for most of these kinds of papers, and I say papers, not abstract, because, everyone handles paper writing in different ways. My suggestion, the very first thing you do with any paper you write the abstract first. Write the abstract first, because if you get a really good 250 word statement, or whatever the abstract length is, you feel really good about it, that's basically the outline of your paper. You just stretch that out. That's the rest of your paper. So start here, start small, and then work your way up using that same structure. So it's one thing to say, I have a problem. And then another key mechanic to implement in these kind of abstracts is, this isn't just a problem, this is the consequence of ignoring it. Right? It's not just, I have a gap in the literature. Right? This is what happens if we don't address the gap. Right? And by now, you're only like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sentences in, and hopefully gotten to the point where you've not only told people engaged people, given them the and, but now you've gotten through the conflict, you've gotten through the butt of your story. And the remainder of the abstract is all about getting to the resolution. This is how we're going to solve the problem. All right. So right after those two conflict statements, you got to a place where now I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do to solve this. And then you just go through the description, and even in the context of these kinds of sentences, you want to be able to get to a place where you're using a lot of the same language. So it's purposeful that this sentence includes the word paradigm, and then we start the next sentence with the word paradigm. The closer you can connect those two things together, the easier that next sentence is absorbed by your audience. You start giving people a little bit of a description of it, right? And then you're kind of also connecting using a connecting sentence to sort of bring the story back to that recent work on mechanisms of change sentence. So you're using evidence to sort of talk about how you can use this paradigm to then connect the ways in which we think about exposures to recent work on mechanisms of change in therapy. The last few sentences are basically the body of the remainder of the paper, right? So you're basically sort of telling people what the key aims are. This, if you think about, each of these kinds of sentences are the buildup of the introduction to the paper, and these last two sentences are basically the purpose section of the introduction, and by extension, the body of the paper, right? And this sort of gets to the idea of why these abstracts are so important. These abstracts, when you write them well, they're basically telling you exactly how, giving you a structured plan for figuring out how to write the rest of it. So the key thing to sort of take home with this is that, to the degree that you write your abstract in this way and sort of apply mechanics to sentence structure, to transitions between ideas, you'll not only be able to arrive at a piece of work that holistically tells a story, but you're also going to be able to infuse those storytelling elements in every word, in every sentence, and in every paragraph. And that's the power of storytelling. It's like a cell in your body. It scales all the way down to sentences and paragraphs, scales all the way up to entire bodies of work, not just one paper, but lots of papers. So, I'm a big fan of homework. Here's the upside with workshops is that they're short. And if the person doing the workshopping likes what they're doing, hopefully they're a little fun, or they make it engaging or fun. The downside is the literature is very clear. Workshops don't do a thing in changing behavior. They just don't change behavior. I think that in all likelihood, to the degree this is of benefit to any of you who are in the audience, my goal, my hope, is that I've gotten you curious about storytelling. I've gotten you curious about using storytelling in the context of writing mechanics. And then hopefully I've gotten you curious enough to spend some time to read some more material, like the Houston book, as an example, or to see more workshops, or to start using this stuff yourself. And then one of the ways in which you try to move that along or help that along is with homework. And this is what I would suggest that you try to do with one of your old abstracts, is go back to the abstract, try to unpack it, try to apply the and but therefore to it. Is it there? If it's not there, can I revise it? Can I move it around? All right. Try to start working through it. One thing I can tell you, not everybody's experience is the same, but if your experience with storytelling is anything like mine, at the beginning of the process of using these principles, it'll feel mechanical, it'll feel artificial, it won't feel like it's your writing, it'll feel almost like you're an engineer, and none of us are engineers. But over time, the more you apply these principles to each piece of writing you start working on, the more the ideas will become habitual, instinctual. And I can tell you that now storytelling comes out of my mouth and on paper, and when I'm writing down, it comes out by accident. It just comes out. And it just makes the writing process, I think, a lot more enjoyable and a lot more straightforward. Okay, so we worked through an illustration that helps us see these writing mechanics and how the intersection between writing mechanics and the and but therefore structure come to life in the context of writing a very short piece of an overall piece of work, just the abstract. Now, what does that look like when you scale it up beyond the abstract and go to whole pieces of the paper, even the whole paper itself? And that's where we're gonna go next. So what I'd like for us to do is break for about 10 minutes. It'll still leave us plenty of time. And I'd like you to skim this article. It's only 2 pages. It's a science paper from about 15 years ago. And brief backstory, it's one of the first places where I started noticing how powerful storytelling was. I just didn't have any idea what about the paper felt compelling? What was it that made it like a powerful description of work, a powerful report of a study? It wasn't until about 7 years afterwards that I started realizing, oh, the reason why that paper made a whole lot of sense is that it had a fantastic narrative structure. So we'll go back to this paper. It's short, it's to the point, and I'll walk you through each thing. But in the meantime, again, let's take a 10-minute break. All right, welcome back, everybody. What we can do is I'd like to sort of get an idea from you as you've skimmed through the article. What sort of things sort of felt familiar to you based on what we've been discussing so far? And sort of give you a sense of what I'm talking about. When you think about the introduction to one of these like research papers, what you start noticing is it's obviously a little more complex than how I was laying out these mechanics as they map onto writing an abstract. But nonetheless, you still see that connectivity between different pieces of the introduction. The introduction starts off in these papers with that general context statement, those narrowing context statements, those conflicts, and in the context of an introduction section, then you get all the way down to what you expect to find, right? But did anybody have any sort of like thoughts about sort of what jumped out at them as they were reading the article?
I can talk.
Sure.
So I think the first thing that stood out to me when I was skimming it was those like opening sentences of each paragraph, in that like very clear flow, like you were talking earlier, from like a main point in the paragraph previous that they then transition on in with that opening sentence.
Yeah, so something like this, right? Yeah, like the opening sentence, like right from the beginning of the article,
Yeah, even like those first 3 paragraphs are very clear in that transition of, okay, I've addressed this topic and I'm going to, the next paragraph, I'm going to expand on that. And in that expansion, I'm going to bring up a new topic that I'm then going to carry over in the next one, and like developing that whole, I guess, like storyline of the topic.
Yeah. You see that from the opening of the actual article.
Yeah.
And you see, unlike an abstract where you have to get to that broadening and narrowing right after the other, sometimes an introduction needs a little more space to breathe. And so you'll see a few sentences that are connected in ideas that then get to like this place that the article eventually gets down to, this idea of those competing dimensions of the ways we see other people, right? And how often it's studied, and interestingly enough, how often it's studied, but how little it's understood. And that's like that sort of, and that's one of the things that brings the storytelling and the introduction to life, is that it's a long studied topic. People have been trying to understand it and unpack it for a long time, but then you still have even though people have dedicated so much attention to it, you still have really basic questions that you're still trying to ask. And that's the other nice thing about the mechanics, is that the other things the authors do really well is they pull the audience in by posing questions directly in the article. So what does it mean exactly to perceive someone as a warm versus a cold person? So
yeah, I actually
turn.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to.
Oh, go ahead.
I was actually like wondering about those. So for me, like those kind of sentences seem a little bit more informal, and something that I think I would naturally shy away from incorporating in an academic paper.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was reading this, I was kind of surprised that, I don't know, it seems a little bit more formal, like informal, mixed in with the academic writing, and what really is the protocol with that? Like,
And
is
that's
it
the tension, right?
yeah,
Because
so like,
you're
is
used to
that a
seeing it.
strong,
I,
yeah,
me personally, I think that we should be doing more of this. It's very unlikely that as a researcher writing a paper submitting to a journal, to the degree that that question is actually used, that tool is used effectively, it's very unlikely a reviewer is going to say take it out. It feels colloquial. It feels like something informal. In actuality, my strong sense with this is that you want your audience to feel like you're speaking one-on-one with them. That's the goal. The goal with all of this writing is you want people to feel like you're sitting in their office. You're sitting with them on the train as they're reading the paper, and you're literally speaking with them in that kind of one direction. I think in that kind of sense, these questions they work in really nice ways. And this is a paper in science. I mean, this if any place is supposed to be regal with his language, it'd be a place like this, and it works really, really effectively. Yeah, so I would fight against that instinct. Where you're going to use it, where you think it can be effective. I think these questions are the questions like this can be really effective mechanics, because they get an audience thinking that you're speaking to them. So then what happens is that the authors sort of get to this idea of, this kind of way in which to perceive people is kind of like a screening item on a survey or something, right? What are the kind of observations that people having? You will notice. So I'm seeing one from Katie. I really liked how the author was able to use the ABT framework and make each paragraph more and more specific, but was still able to tie in common themes throughout the paper at each stage of narrowing focus. In other words, the authors were able to see the forest for the trees and never got so granular they lost sight of their purpose. Exactly right. So that's a really great observation you made there, Katie, in the sense that if you think about these sentences as trees, you think about the narrative structure as a forest. Where you're then able to get to is now I need to be intentional. What does each sentence do to help me build that forest? Each one of these is a tree I'm planting in the ground, and then I got to get to the forest. That's a really good way of thinking about it. Yes. So starting at the end of that Ash statement, exactly right. So this piece is, I think, one of the most brilliant turns in the entire article. And in fact, what wound up being the thing that really caught my attention when I first read the article, before I even knew the storytelling was a thing, before I even knew what the ingredients were, before I knew what even the structure was. So when I read this article for the first time, and I caught this passage of text that I highlighted here, what popped in my mind was, this is brilliant, because the authors made themselves look like Indiana Jones. Like this is the expansive history of research on these topics, and people have not been able to get to answering this kind of question, but they left a clue. But they left a clue as a brilliant transition, because what it insinuates is they left a clue, and guess who found it? Guess who discovered that clue? It's brilliant. It's a brilliant mechanic. And so long as you're able to pull it off and tell people what the clue is, but so you have to be able to come through what you promised. But something like that is not only engaging, it's telling people nobody's been able to figure this out, but I did. And it's also introducing a little bit of a conflict. Nobody's really figured this out, but I did. And then you resolve it by showing people what the clue is. Let's go to the next one. All right. So here's the other nice thing, is that the left a clue piece, what then the authors start doing is start going back to literature and piecing the clues together, right? And they start identifying pieces of literature, prior work, and then what they start doing, this is a neat mechanic, that sentence, that in this way sentence, is a really nice turn, because not only are they able to give an example in everyday life of a circumstance where some of these processes might illuminate, but take a wild guess what's going to play a key role in the study itself. Right? This is the hot cold coffee study. This is exactly what they did in their method. It is brilliant. It's brilliant because what it does is it takes the body of work, instantiates it in an element of everyday life that also happens to be a key component of the methods of the study. Absolutely brilliant, right? And all these things, all these different mechanics, they're in the service of the larger story, and so and all of us can do it. These are all things that all of us can do, because we all get a lot of practice consuming stories. These are all things researchers can do. All of us are capable of doing it, and what better researchers to do it than psychologists? Because all we do is get practice seeing patterns in behavior. We can pick these things apart like nobody's business, because this is our business, right? These, and I think these are seeing examples like this are really nice, because then you're able to see, oh, they can do it, I can too. And you know how I know that? Lawrence Williams, the first author in the paper, he and I went to grad school together. He published this paper in grad school. Right? This stuff can be done by anybody, by anyone at any stage in their career. Yeah, and so this what's also neat about the introduction is that he going back to the idea of clues, he takes several pieces of work. They take several pieces of work and show the connectivity across different literatures. The clues are present everywhere. They're present in one line of literature, present in another line of literature. They're present in still another area of the literature, right? So what the thing he's doing there is he's taking an idea, like, I found this clue, and just so you know, my idea about this being a clue has a lot of currency, because you can link it to all these other literatures that all of us respect and care about. All of us understand and know. That's another nice mechanic too, is being able to figure out, like, if I'm going to convince an audience that this clue is both innovative and likely on the right track, I got to connect it to other things you respect, to other things you care about, to the degree that I can give this idea currency by tying it to other things. That's going to make the audience even more convinced this is probably the right way to go. And that's shown in the connections that they link between the clue into the literatures. Now, in the context of a science paper, yeah, you got to go pretty broad and start connecting literatures that look very different from each other. They're very different modalities. But you can use the same principle, even if you're taking a paper and you're submitting it to a specialty journal that only cares about a specific kind of body of work. You can do the same kind of thing, connect areas, and sort of give currency to an idea. And then the end result of the introduction, this is the end of their introduction. Science papers are weird because you got to do it all in like a few hundred words. But what you saw on that first page is basically a very short version of the 5 pages we all write for our introductions. Right? And this last section is basically the purpose statement of their introduction. Now, the rule that I think everyone should try to follow when you're writing one of these introductions, and once you get to this purpose paragraph, here's the rule that I always suggest people should follow. Once you've drafted all the material for your introduction, ask yourself this question. Like, would somebody who's never read my paper before, could they get to this paragraph and be like, you know what? Don't even tell me the last paragraph. Aim 1 is this, aim 2 is this, aim 3 is this. These are your 3 hypotheses. All right, let's skip to the method. That's how the introduction should read. The introduction should always read like that paragraph, no surprises. It is, you spoiled everything. Spoiler alert, spoiler alert, spoiler. You spoiled everything before you got to that paragraph. That paragraph's just rehashing stuff that the reader should already know if they've paid attention to the rest of your stuff. No surprises. Right? And then you get your method. And what I love about that is about the paper is that it sort of instantiates that same principle, that a story can occur in a very short period, in a very short bit of space. You hear story for the first time, the first thing you think to yourself is, well, I don't got that kind of time. I don't got that kind of space to do that. I show a lot of film clips in my workshops. You've probably seen a few of them, and I get a lot of my film clips from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. There's this really great scene in the third Captain America, where it's like a eulogy scene, and one of the central characters is sort of eulogizing somebody who recently passed away, a central character in the story, and they're only on camera for a minute, and in that minute, there's not just one story. There's like several stories in that 1 minute of script. It's brilliant. And that's the great thing about storytelling. It scales up, scales down. Okay, so the great thing about these about writing mechanics is that it takes the ABC structure and illustrates the idea that you can overlay this structure onto a piece of writing, but you have to be intentional. You have to intentionally connect each of the pieces of what you're trying to write, so that they can they're in all in the service of a larger story. And the way you do that is try to break down ABT into smaller and smaller components, depending on where you are in that sequence, in the storytelling sequence. So a few things you might be asking yourself. What happens if this is for more like a review or a book chapter, right? So the idea would be, for something like a review, sort of think about those sentences, like in the abstract, as kind of different sections of the overall paper. So if you go back to that previous abstract from the first illustration, these first few sentences are basically the first, couple of pages of your introduction, where you're sort of laying out for the audience, what the general scenario is like. Around the end of the second page, beginning of the third page, is when you start sort of articulating what the solution is, right? This is what you're going to plan on doing, maybe even the fourth page, and then you're kind of sort of illuminating there what the bits and pieces are, like how this is going to help solve the problem. And then that purpose section of your introduction, right, is not only encapsulated in these last sections, these last two sentences, sorry about that, last two sentences, but these last few sentences are also key portions of the paper. So right after your introduction, this is the first piece of the body of the paper, the conceptual and empirical foundations, followed by some direction for future research, and then report, and then data supporting that that's the direction you should go. And the last couple pages of the entire paper are just illuminating what the implications of the work actually are, right? So you know, when you think about these principles, they do generalize to lots of other circumstances, not just these empirical studies. You can use these same kinds of strategies when you're thinking about review papers and other kinds of pieces of narrative work. You know, sometimes the places where people have a hard time thinking about the applicability of these ideas has to do with the drier portions of the paper, like the methods and the results. Should you be telling a story there? With the methods, it's probably less of a concern, because the purpose of a method section is not necessarily to tell a good story. The purpose of the method section is to ensure that if somebody wanted to recreate exactly what you did, you've given them all the information where they can. That's the goal of the method section. It's less tell a good story and more about results. Are a little bit different. Results, if you think about storytelling as, I'm trying to organize the facts in a way that maximize the likelihood that you absorb them, then I would think about the results as thinking about like what's a piece of the findings. Let's assume you have 3 major things you're looking at. What are a piece of the findings that I think that I think can help engage the audience with the results? What's a piece that might be a little bit of a conflict, that, like, you know, maybe it's an interesting finding, but there are some interpretive issues. And then many of our results sections have secondary analyses, sensitivity analyses. So you might already be framing the results section that way, but if you think about it intentionally, then you're able to think about, well, okay, how do I go from that first or second thing that I'm reporting a finding about and the secondary analysis? Usually a secondary analysis or a sensitivity analysis is designed to try to resolve a problem or a conflict that you see in your earlier findings. You know, these last couple of analyses didn't take into account this factor, and so my sensitivity analysis, I did this. There's a resolution there. So in the results section, you can still get back to storytelling. It's not necessarily straight facts. It's all about, I'm not trying to con anybody. I'm not trying to like tell somebody a version of the facts that isn't true. Rather, you're saying to yourself, I have a set of facts. I don't want to go one fact after the other without really thinking about the structure. How do I make sure that I organize the sequence in a way that maximizes the likelihood people actually get it? They actually are able to absorb it. And then the discussion of this, the discussion section kind of does the inverse of what you're trying to do with the introduction. So if you go back, people talk about this all the time, like a funnel plot. Like the funnel is like, you know, you start off broad with the introduction, go in. Discussion is like go narrow, go broader. It's kind of the way that you should think about these using these mechanics. The mechanics are kind of going in the reverse direction that we were talking about with regards to the introduction. So maybe starting off narrow and going more broad. So narrowing context sentences to start off with, and then broadening context sentences afterwards. So, in the service of homework, please do some homework. One thing you could do: go back to the article, go back to the paper that you said you were working on. You might look out for the abstract in illustration number 1, and try to see if you can apply these principles to the mechanics of the draft that you're actually working on, and trying to see like where can I start using some of these principles. And you know what I would do also is, you know, I showed you one good example, that Williams and Barge paper, a good example of a nice, well-structured story. You know what I might also consider doing is, you know, going back to papers you've read before in class for your thesis, stuff you read recently that really resonated with you. Like, I really like this author. They write really compelling pieces of work. They're really easy to understand. It's like fun to read their work, and then go in and pick it apart. Like you read for content already. You read that paper already. There are no surprises. Now you want to go in and pick it apart and look at its structure, like almost like an engineer. And if you think about your work almost like I'm reverse engineering stories and I'm looking for the best examples possible to figure out how to start using this in my own work. mean, I think that's where the magic happens with the storytelling, because the more you read and consume things that tell good stories, the easier it's going to be for you to start picking apart what people are doing right, and then how can I repeat that with my own writing. A lot of times I suggest to people, maybe research isn't like the first place you might go, because we're as a collective group, we're still trying to get a sense of how to do this on a consistent basis, how to tell good stories consistently. I go back to things in popular media, documentaries that I really liked, movies I really liked, clips of movies I really liked, books I really liked, podcasts I really liked. I go back to those things and I'm like, what are they doing right? And then sort of figuring out, can I do something similar with this thing I'm working on? Go to where great stories happen, and try to lift ideas from there. Because in all likelihood, if it works there, it's going to work for your writing too. I heavily recommend you all read the Olson book. The Olson book is just brilliant. And I mentioned before what it felt like at the beginning of using it, like you force it on top of your writing because most of us aren't used to writing that way. But over time, this is what's neat about this. This approach really is the gift that keeps on giving. Now, about 7 years after I've started using it, like I don't feel like I write anymore. I feel like I'm composing something. I'm composing music. I'm putting together episodes for a pilot that I'm going to do for Netflix or something, right? And by that I mean, if you're going to put together a pilot for a show, or you're going to write a song, you have to know the beginning and middle and end, basically from the beginning, right? And so nowadays, when I write, I'll write the end parts sometimes because it just hits like, oh, now I know how the concluding paragraph's got to be at. Let me just go ahead and do that now before I forget, and then you just go back. But it changes your outlook on what writing looks like. It's like a time machine. You don't feel like you're writing it. Okay, introduction, method, result. You don't feel like you're doing it anymore in a sequential way. You just find the order in things, and then you figure out like what should I start working on next. Yeah, and not just for papers. It really like I'll work on an email. And I'll send it out, and I'll click on the send folder. There's a story in there, and I didn't even plan on doing it. It just comes out. It helps with teaching. It helps with like nowadays I'll use storytelling to sort of figure out like when in a class I'll put a lecture, just to make sure that people understand like that all of this work sort of fits within the fabric of a discipline, right? And it makes it much easier to sort of convey content to a class. I can't recommend it more. Yeah, it's never, and I'm living proof. Never too late to start. All right. Well, we have another workshop next week. Yep, and it's actually a really interesting workshop on navigating mentoring relationships that aren't going quite the way you planned. It's going to be a really helpful workshop, I think, for a lot of folks, because all of us have great mentors, and some of us have some mentors where we're like, uh-oh, what do I do now? And so that's going to be a workshop all about that. Great. Thank you so much for your time, everybody. This was a lot of fun. We'll post this online soon, and we'll let folks know on Twitter that it's up. Okay.